Hi, I'm going to offer my usual disclaimer. I am not a videographer and I am certainly not an actress, but I am going to make a video to just more thoroughly review for you the math consultation project guidelines and give you additional information that hopefully will be helpful to you as you engage in this project. So if you'll notice, if you open the math consultation intervention project tab in the blue menu, you'll open up and it will talk to you about, it will give you information about due dates, etc. And if you click right here, it will give you the guidelines for this project. So let's go through those together. Okay, so by this point, you've decided where you're going to be doing your project. You've decided whether you're going to be, for instance, working at the Garcia Center and using a consultative model where you're providing materials to someone else that they will actually implement in terms of instruction, or whether you're going to be providing that instruction yourself. So let's go through this pretty carefully. First thing you're going to do is you're going to assess your student, because as we've discussed many times, your instruction should be based on assessment data that tells you what that child's strengths are, what their needs are, and from this perspective, we're looking at ourselves as interventionists. So we're not trying to provide the entire math curriculum for that student. We're trying to make sure that we are providing the kind of supports in terms of skill development that will ensure that student is more successful in the math curriculum outside of their work with us. In terms of the assessment summary, you first need to describe your student, the age, the grade level, race, ethnicity. You always need to know a student's language status. Now remember, none of y'all have done or will do a fluency measure, a language fluency measure on these students. So I find a lot of times my students will want to say, well, this child is fluent in English or this child is fluent in Spanish. You're not really going to know that, because fluency, an assessment or a determination of fluency is done based on assessment. But you can say, this child speaks only English, this child speaks, both English and another language, or another language is spoken in this child's family, etc. If the tutors know, or if other personnel at the Garcia Center know, ask if the child is an English learner so that you can take that into account as you do your planning. And you need to make sure then that you're paying attention, as we would with all learners, but particular attention to vocabulary. And if it's a child who receives instruction in their native language at school, then you may need to be thinking about what language is going to be used and how can we incorporate that native language into your intervention. You need to know, if at all possible, the child's disability status. That may or may not be information that you can obtain, but you certainly want to ask if there are any disabilities you should be aware of. If at all possible, please observe the student that you're going to work with during math instruction or during math tutorial if you're at the Garcia Center. Try to find out when that is. What you see may be more along the lines of homework support, but find out if there's a dedicated time that they're working with that student in the area of mathematics. For those of you working in other settings, hopefully you'll be able to observe that student during mathematics instruction, and you're going to write up a summary of that observation. And make sure you're including some relevant details, like how many students were involved in that instruction, what was the time frame, what materials were being used, what were the students expected to do, what kind of feedback they get, all of that detailed information. Then you're going to go through and you're going to do your assessments. And I'm going to also upload an assessment video to this link. But just make sure, to this folder, just make sure that you are really reviewing what we discussed in class in terms of the assessments you're going to use. Make sure you have done as much preparation as you can to be familiar with those assessments in advance. And make sure that if you're unsure about something that you ask, please let me know. I'll try to answer any questions that you have. But it's really important, garbage in, garbage out. The quality of what we do is really reliant on the quality of those assessments that you'll be giving. And then include any additional information you feel like is needed to inform an understanding of the scores. So we obviously have limited time with these students, but if you know the student you know, is unhappy about something, or that there's something else going on with the student that might influence how they perform in those assessments, you certainly want to know that. Remember that you're going to write that up, you're going to submit it, and then once it is submitted, I will give you some feedback so that you can revise or make any modifications that are needed to be done in preparation for completing your instructional recommendation summary. So now let's talk about that. It is very important that you include specific strengths of this learner. And while you can include any kind of strength that you like and what you observe, it is critical that you include strengths in the area of mathematics, because again, we always want to build on strengths as we address needs. And that's the second thing you're going to discuss. So what were the child's strengths and what did you observe that the child need, or what supports do they need to be more successful? You're going to develop a one-sentence short-term objective, and that should include what we call a condition. So under what circumstances will the child exhibit a behavior, and then what criteria are you going to use to determine the success of that intervention? So I'll give you an example. These short-term objectives need to be tied to one or more of the assessments that you're doing. So let's say that your student made a certain score on the benchmark, or had a certain score on the key math, one of the subtests of the key math. Then when you write your short-term objective, you're going to say, following 5 weeks of intervention focused on blah, blah, the student will score whatever the criteria is on this assessment by this date. If you have questions about that, please see me. But again, your condition is what kind of intervention is you provided. Then your behavior is a certain performance on the assessment, and the criteria is whatever that score is going to be, okay? You can use one subtest or more than one subtest, depending upon what you think is appropriate for the student and how much time you have to work with them. You're going to provide specific materials and resources that can be used to address the needs that you've identified. And please make sure, if you are doing this in consultation with another person and they're going to actually be implementing the intervention, you need to be very, very specific and provide enough detail that a novice person would know what you intend. So it's very helpful if you can provide a model. You certainly need to provide either links to materials or actual materials that the person's going to use. You explain how they're going to go about doing that. You're also going to provide a mechanism for gathering weekly progress monitoring data. You may want to use some of those weekly probes that are available that I've left for you at the Garcia Center that you're also going to use for pre-assessment. You may want to design something else, but at least once a week, you want to gather some kind of progress monitoring data to tell how the child is responding to that intervention. And remember, this is formative, not summative data. So the reason we do that is to help inform our teaching and know, is what we're doing seeming to have the effect that we were hoping that it would. And then I want, as you share those materials, if you're not doing the intervention yourself, you're going to be sharing them in a consultation meeting with whoever is going to be doing that teaching, that actual teaching, and I want you to write up a summary of that consultation meeting. Now, it may be face-to-face. It may be that you leave materials for someone and you ask them to call you and you have that meeting on the phone. But whatever it is, I want you to summarize what you did to ensure that you provided as much information as possible to the person who's going to be providing that instruction. And then you're going to check in with that person, or you're going to be doing that intervention. We should, given our timelines, have somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks in which children can receive some instruction. And yes, I know that we sometimes deal with absences or things go on, but you want to be really clear about when the instruction occurred and when it didn't. Because particularly when we implement multi-tiered systems of support and we're trying to make determinations about how children are responding to the instruction they're receiving, we want to be particularly sure that if the child really wasn't getting in the intervention, we're noting that and we're not expecting growth based on something that didn't happen. You're gonna go back at the end of the semester. You're gonna repeat the assessments that you've done now to be able to see what kind of growth that you've had. Obviously, we're not going to be able to give ourselves or the interventions we design full credit for the child's growth because they're going to school, right? So this is not a situation where we are able to look at an intervention in a control group and determine, how much impact what we did had. But I do think it's important for us to be able to talk about this is where the child scored, at baseline, and this is where they're scoring now. You're going to go back, you're going to observe again. And if at all possible, you should observe the student during the intervention. So try to find out, when are you going to be using, the strategies, materials that were recommended. Go observe that. You're going to gather that progress monitoring data as you're going, and you're going to include that in your consultation summary. So what were we noticing throughout those weeks of intervention? You're going to reassess and report on the assessment and the scores obtained. And I should have said this up front when I talked about the pre-assessment, but you also are going to explain those scores and that assessment in a way that, people without a lot of background in education can understand. Now you are going to look at, what is the score? How does that compare to the expected benchmark? That should always be what you're talking about. The child's either at the benchmark, they've met it, or they are not there, and this is what we're doing to address that, right? When you're reporting on the key math, you need to talk about what the raw score is and the scaled score, and then the confidence interval, and then what that means in terms of age or grade level equivalency. All of that information should be included as you describe the assessments that you've provided and the scores that you've completed and the scores that you've obtained. And again, any other information you feel like should be considered. You're going to sit down and follow up and do another consultation meeting if you're not doing the instruction yourself, and find out what the impression was of the person who was doing the teaching. And then the last thing I want you to do is make recommendations for future instruction. So as folks continue to work with this student, what would you recommend? The very last part of this project is a self-reflection piece. I want you to summarize your own strengths and how you leverage them in completing the project. And then things you learned about yourself in terms of the conduct of consultation and your role in the process, or the conduct of intervention and your role in the process, and then a summary of things you would do differently in the future. And look, there may be all kinds of things that you would recommend be done differently in terms of the instructional arrangement or whatever that's going on with the student you're working with, but this is supposed to be focused on you. What did you learn about yourself, and what would you do differently going down the road? So with that said, let me go through and talk to you a little bit about how this project will be evaluated. So I'm going to pull up the rubric here. So again, going into our consultation and intervention project area, if you go in where you're supposed to actually turn in the project, which is the next link, I'm going to open that up, and you can view the rubric. The total points available for the total points available for this project, 88 will actually come from the final product that you submit at the end of the semester. You'll notice section 1 is that assessment summary. It talks about, have you addressed all the required components? Is your information clear and comprehensible? Do you provide a strong rationale for whatever instructional recommendations you're getting ready to recommend? So I should have a pretty complete picture in that assessment summary of that child and their performance. Now remember, you're going to submit it for 6 points. You're going to submit your draft. And then you're going to take that feedback I gave you and you're going to resubmit here. So you really should be able to obtain almost all of those points if you follow through and make the recommended changes. Same is true with the instructional recommendation summary. Are all the components there? Is your goal or your objective relevant and measurable? Is there a plan for progress monitoring that's clearly aligned? Section 3, follow-up summary. So you have all those details in the guidelines about what's supposed to be included. We're looking to make sure that you've included them and that you've done a good job on that and you've been very thorough and comprehensible. If you're only generally addressing these things, then your score is going to fall more toward the competent than the proficient range. And I certainly hope none of you are scoring in the novice range, but that has happened when folks were not really addressing the components of the guidelines. Okay, you're going to have that self-reflection piece that we just discussed. And then I'm also going to look at the quality of your writing, because one of the things that this project is designed to support you in doing is to develop professional writing skills. You will be asked to observe and assess and report on children in the context of your work. And so this is an opportunity. So even though, like, we all talk about kids all the time, we don't write the word kid. We talk about a child or a student. You know, you're going to use professional language, and certainly no spelling, grammar mistakes, anything like that. So then let's go back to that tab again. And you're going to see that there is a place for you to turn in your assessment summary graph, your instructional recommendations draft, and both of those also have rubrics attached. It's 6 points for each, and as I mentioned to you in class, basically, if you submit and you include all of the required information, you should be able to get the points from that. Okay? So with that said, please let me know if you have any questions, and I will also be posting a video that describes or reviews those assessment guidelines.